The arena held 4,000 people that night, and by 7 in the evening every seat had been claimed. The overhead lights cast a pale industrial wash across the floor. The air smelled of chalk dust and cigarette smoke, and the particular tension that gathers in a room when people sense something is about to happen without knowing what it will be. Jean-Claude Van Damme was 22 years old. He stood in the center of the exhibition floor in a white gi that had not yet earned a single wrinkle, and the 4,000 people watching him understood immediately that he was something built differently from most men. 6 feet even, 189 pounds of structured muscle. Each group trained in isolation, and then trained together. The way a composer arranges instruments rather than simply playing them louder. He had been competing in full-contact karate and kickboxing across Europe for 3 years, and had not been defeated in any format, not once. His record stood at 31 fights, 31 conclusions in his favor. 18 of those conclusions arriving before the judges were needed. He had won the European Karate Championship at 19. He had trained under Dominique Valera, one of the 3 or 4 men alive whose opinion on technique was not a guess. He was not a young man with potential. He was a young man who had already converted potential into fact, repeatedly in front of credentialed witnesses. He threw a left roundhouse that connected with the wooden target at eye level, and the crack it produced silenced the warm-up conversations near the floor. He threw it again, and again. Each repetition identical in trajectory and power to the one before it, the way a machine performs rather than a man, and the crowd near the floor took a step back without discussing it. In the 4th row, center section, a man in a plain gray jacket and a dark cap sat with his arms resting on his knees. He had arrived 12 minutes before the doors opened. He had taken his seat without speaking to anyone around him. He was 38 years old, though he could have passed for a decade less. And also a decade more depending on the light and depending on what he had just done. He had been awarded a 6th degree black belt in Tang Soo Do. He had a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at a time when almost no American had encountered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He had spent 4 years in the United States Air Force. He had won the Professional Karate Association middleweight title and held it for 6 consecutive years. He had appeared in 4 films. He had trained people who now trained other people, a chain that stretched across 3 continents. He was sitting in the 4th row in a gray jacket that had seen better seasons, and he was watching Van Damme work, and his face showed nothing beyond attention. His name was Chuck Norris. Nobody in the building knew he was there. In 31 seconds that would change. In the 31 seconds that followed, something would happen in this room that the people closest to it would spend the next 4 decades telling to their students. And their students would tell their students. And each retelling would carry slightly different numbers and slightly different words. But the center of the story would never move. Because the center of the story was not numbers and it was not words. The center of the story was a choice that a young man made in front of 4,000 people, and what that choice cost him, and what it gave him. Stay with this, until the end. The private sentence spoken in that room has never been repeated in public. Not in any interview. Not in any memoir. You will hear it for the first time today. Van Damme finished his warm-up and took the microphone that a tournament official extended toward him. This was a scheduled moment, a brief address to the crowd before the evening's exhibition bouts began. Van Damme had done this before. He was comfortable in front of crowds in the way that certain people are comfortable in mirrors. He thanked the officials in French. He thanked the crowd. He spoke about what karate meant to him, and what European martial arts had built in the decades since American influence had carried the sport across the Atlantic. Then he paused. He looked at the crowd in the way a person looks when they are deciding whether to say the thing they have been thinking about saying. He said it. He said that the era of American dominance in the martial arts world had produced real champions, genuine ones, and he respected that era and the men who represented it. He said that those men had built something worth building. Then he said that every era ends. He said that what Europe had developed in the last 10 years had surpassed the American standard not in power but in refinement. And that some of the American names the crowd might be familiar with would not survive 20 seconds on a European floor against a current European competitor. The crowd shifted. A journalist 3 rows behind Chuck Norris set her pen flat on her notebook and did not pick it up again. Van Damme did not say Chuck Norris by name. He did not have to. The context was sufficient. The timeline he was describing had one name at its center, and every person in the building understood that. Chuck Norris did not move. He did not change his posture. He had his arms on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and if the man beside him had not been watching carefully, he would have assumed the gray jacket was simply waiting for the exhibition to begin. The man beside him was watching carefully. Chuck Norris reached up and removed his cap. He held it in his left hand, folded the brim once with 2 fingers and set it on the seat to his right. He stood without using his hands to push off the seat. He moved into the aisle. This is the moment the witnesses disagree on in the retelling.
Not because they saw different things, but because what they saw did not match any prior experience. He did not walk with speed. He did not walk with visible purpose. He walked the way a man walks when he has already completed the journey internally, and the physical movement is simply paperwork.
He moved down the aisle toward the floor. The crowd began to recognize him in the way that recognition moves through a crowd, not as an announcement but as a current passing from one person to the next, row by row, from the floor outward, quiet and accelerating. By the time he stepped onto the exhibition floor, the current had reached the back wall. He did not introduce himself. He looked at Van Damme the way you look at something you are trying to understand and have not yet finished understanding. He said, "I would like to find out if you have been watching this channel and you have not yet subscribed. This is the moment to do it. What happens in the next 11 seconds will not appear anywhere else in this detail. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments what country you are watching from tonight." Van Damme was 22 years old and he had not been defeated in 31 competitions, and he was standing in the center of his home floor in front of 4,000 people who had come specifically to see him, and a man in a gray jacket had walked down 4 rows and asked to find out. He understood what was happening. His trainer Dominique Valera was standing 8 feet to his left and had not moved and had not spoken, because Valera was one of the men in the world who knew immediately what the gray jacket meant, and Valera understood that instruction had become insufficient. Van Damme said, "All right. A fight is not 2 men making contact. A fight begins 6 feet before any contact occurs, and is decided in the space between them before either man has moved. The 6 feet of distance separating 2 trained fighters is not empty, it is dense with information, each man reading weight distribution, breath rate, shoulder alignment, the angle of the lead foot. The man who reads that information correctly and acts on it first has effectively ended the contest before it begins." Chuck Norris had been reading that information professionally for 20 years. He closed to 4 feet. He stopped. Van Damme was faster than almost anyone Norris had faced. This was visible in how he stood. The weight slightly elevated in the balls of the feet. The hands positioned for a rapid first exchange. The whole structure of him arranged for offensive initiation. He had beaten 31 opponents, and the way he had beaten most of them was by being first. Norris read all of this in the time it takes a clock to produce a single sound. Second one. Van Damme threw a lead left roundhouse aimed at the right side of the head. It was the same technique he had thrown in the warm-up. It was precise, committed, and fast enough that the front 3 rows of spectators leaned back from it involuntarily. Norris moved 4 inches to the left. The foot passed. He did not block it. He did not catch it. He moved, and the foot found nothing. The tournament director, a man named Bernard Chevalier, who had overseen martial arts competition in France for 11 years, later said that he had never seen distance managed that simply against that technique in a live situation. Second 2, Van Damme reset. This was notable. Most opponents required a breath after the first exchange. Van Damme was composed enough to reset without one. He threw a right straight punch, textbook form, the weight behind it. Norris's head was not where the punch was aimed. It had moved before the punch arrived, and his left hand was now near the inside of Van Damme's extended arm. The boom operator assigned to film the exhibition for the event's promotional materials lowered his equipment without realizing he had done it. Second 3, Van Damme backed out. This was not retreat. It was strategy. He was attempting to reset the distance and begin the sequence again with better information. Norris followed at the same pace, not faster. The same pace. This is a specific technique that is rarely taught in formal settings and almost never visible at a high level. The maintenance of the same distance during an opponent's withdrawal, which denies the opponent the reset without communicating aggression. Van Damme found that the 4 feet between them when he had started moving backward was still 4 feet when he stopped. He had thrown his 2 fastest techniques and was standing in the same position relative to a man who had not thrown anything. He understood what this meant. He was 22 years old and had not been defeated in 31 contests, and he understood in the second of the 4th second what was happening. He threw a combination, left jab, right cross, left body kick, the sequence that had finished 11 of his 18 stoppages. He threw it with full commitment, the way a man throws a technique when he has decided that he has nothing to preserve. Norris moved through the combination the way water moves through gaps in stone. The jab found air. The cross found air. The body kick landed against a forearm that was already positioned there when the kick arrived. A position so early that several witnesses later questioned whether they had seen it correctly. Norris's right hand came to rest 1 inch from the left side of Van Damme's jaw. Still, not retracted, not followed through. Still 1 inch from contact, held there so that Van Damme could observe its location clearly. 4,000 people produced no sound that could be measured. Bernard Chevalier, the tournament director, had both palms flat on the table in front of him and was staring at his own hands. Dominique Valera, Van Damme's trainer, had taken 1 step forward and then stopped. A woman in the 6th row had set her program face down on her knee at some point during the previous 4 seconds and had not noticed. Norris held his hand 1 inch from Van Damme's jaw for a specific duration, 3 full seconds, long enough for the room to understand what had been accomplished, long enough for Van Damme to feel the distance without experiencing the consequence. Then he opened the hand, fingers extended, palm forward, and he held it there. The extended hand. The private sentence came next. 4 words, spoken at a volume only Van Damme could access. It has not been repeated in any interview Norris gave in the 40 years that followed. It has not appeared in any memoir or authorized account. The witnesses nearest to the exchange reported only that Van Damme's expression changed in a specific way that none of them had seen on him before, and that he did not respond immediately. And that when he did respond, he did not use words. He took the hand, not quickly, not slowly, with deliberation, in the way a man accepts something he has decided to accept rather than something that has been forced on him. He took the hand and he held it, and then he placed his other hand briefly on top, and then he released it. The fork in the road was not a dramatic moment. Nobody in the room understood fully what they were witnessing because the decision was being made in a register that was almost invisible. Van Damme could have released the handshake and said something to the crowd. He could have explained the exchange in terms that maintained his position. He could have assigned the outcome a meaning that the crowd might have accepted. He did not. He stood in the center of the floor in front of 4,000 people and said, in French, and clearly enough for the front 20 rows to hear, "It was my mistake. I spoke before I knew." That sentence traveled through the Palais de Sports in the same current that recognition had traveled 3 minutes earlier. Row by row. Back wall. And then it left the building. Norris recovered his cap from the seat where he had left it. He did not unfold the brim. He put it on without adjustment and walked back up the aisle and out the side corridor. 3 people touched his arm as he passed. He acknowledged none of them and all of them with the same motion, a slight forward lean that continued walking. One of those 3 people was a young fighter from Lyon who had been competing for 4 years. He did not wash the jacket he was wearing that evening for 11 months, not because of superstition but because the contact had produced a specific feeling he was not ready to release to the laundry. The story left the Palais de Sports in the mouths of 4,000 people that night and traveled the way all significant things travel, imprecisely and persistently. By the end of the month it had reached dojos in 3 countries. By the end of the year the duration had changed in several versions, the crowd count had inflated in several more, and at least 2 accounts had relocated the incident to a different city. But the center of the story did not move. The center of the story was a young man who had spoken with certainty before earning it, and an older man who had walked down 4 rows to demonstrate the difference without requiring the young man to be destroyed in the demonstration. That element survived every retelling intact, because it was the only element that people needed. Van Damme went on to build a career that would eventually span 50 films, and a level of global recognition that his 22-year-old self in a white gi in Paris might have written down as a goal but would not have assumed. He has spoken in the years since about the education that comes from meeting someone who is not interested in performing superiority, only in transmitting it. He has never named the evening at the Palais de Sports in those conversations. He has never needed to. Norris walked to his car and drove to his hotel and ordered a meal from the room service menu and ate it while looking out the window at a city that was continuing to produce traffic and noise in complete indifference to what had occurred in a building 4 kilometers to the east. There is a lesson in that indifference. The world does not pause to mark the moments when a man chooses honesty over position. The room where it happens holds the weight for a short time. Then the room empties and fills with something else, and the choice passes into the longer record, where it either stands or it does not. What Van Damme said at the Palais de Sports on the floor of the Palais de Sports, that march is what stands. Not the technique, not the exchange, not the 4,000 people or the stopped boom operator or the tournament director's 2 flat palms. The sentence he chose to say when he could have said something else. That is what carries. Every man who has spoken too early before a room remembers the version of himself that chose to stand in it afterward and say so. Most of them keep that memory private. The ones who do not are the ones their students remember. Next week, this channel will bring you the account of the evening in 1986 when Bruce Lee's former training partner walked into a Los Angeles gym and announced that everything Chuck Norris had built his name on was a performance. And the 17 people in that gym witnessed what happened when Norris did not walk away.